Hey, friends. On PlainSpoken, I get to talk with a lot of really interesting people, and some of them I've known for a long time, some of them for, it's our first time talking, really. The person I'm visiting with today, I've spoken with a couple of times. I actually saw her at the Summit, which was an event that was hosted in the Heartland Annual Conference when we were just a TCAT back in the day. And I was really impressed. I'd known who she was. I'd seen her face and her name everywhere. But there's some people, you just don't know how they get where they get and if they really are that gifted and talented. Angela Pleasance is a gifted and talented woman. Instantly, as soon as I spoke to her, I knew that she and I were on the same wavelength. I've been wanting to get her on the PlainSpoken podcast for some time because I think that she has a background and a personal history and insight that is of great use to the Global Methodist Church. I think we're very blessed to have her in leadership. And so what I want to do is I want to read just a brief bio so you understand who she is. And then I'm going to talk to her for a little bit, but I've also made clear to her she doesn't have to go my direction. She has a good sense for what the denomination needs to hear. And so even if you're not a Global Methodist in this time, we're going to be talking about themes that have to do with trauma and healing and how it is that churches in particular, people walking in the footsteps of Jesus, can and should deal with those dark things that people usually don't know how to talk about without getting really nasty. And we're hoping that through this conversation, we can minister to a lot of people who've been damaged in the past and paint a portrait for how it is that they don't have to be and how healing and walking in righteousness essentially can be done even while acknowledging the hurt and harm done before. So here's a bio about Angela, and then I'll bring her on screen. Reverend Angela A. Pleasance serves currently as the Director of Clergy Church Relations with the Global Methodist Church. Angela is a graduate of North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, completing her Bachelor of Science in Business Administration and Marketing, and a graduate of Duke Divinity School with a Master's in Divinity. Currently, she is studying at Wesley Biblical Seminary, Doctor of Ministry program. She served 24 years as a pastor in the United Methodist Church across the Western North Carolina Annual Conference. For 4 of the 24 years, she served as a district superintendent of the Catawba Valley District. Don't correct me on how I said that. She also served on various conference committees, including the Board of Ordained Ministry, the United Methodist Foundation Board of Directors, and cabinet representative to the General Council on Finance and Administration, as well as the chair of the Board of Elders. She's been all over the place, guys. She has been a delegate to general and jurisdictional conferences. She has also served as a chaplain, and this is the particular, it's all interesting, but this is where I knew that I would really enjoy her. A chaplain to various police agencies across North Carolina and the United States Secret Service. And she currently serves as a senior chaplain with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. She serves as a crisis response director of Back the Blue in North Carolina. So there's a lot more about her, but that's just a brief bio that we were able to put together on her. So at this time, Angela, you've been sitting patiently letting me talk about you without talking back to me. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me today. Everybody can see what you look like. I'm sure everybody knows your face at this point. You've been all over GMC stuff for a year now. You're joining me from home this morning, and are you ready for this, sister?
I think I am, but you actually pronounced it correct. It is Catawba.
Catawba.
Yes.
I assume that's a Native American word from a tribe that used to live there, but...
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
And it encompassed 5 counties in that region of North Carolina, which I still live in that particular area, with 166 churches that I had to oversee.
Fun. Yeah, there are a lot of people like me who just barely fit into the UMC to begin with, and then pretty eagerly and readily and ably got out. There are other people who are just really high up and saw the UMC from the inside from a lot of different angles, and that you're one of them. So you were in the United Methodist Church as an elder or clergy in some capacity for 24 years.
Correct. June of 2024, I will be hitting 25 years as a clergy, but 24 of those was in the United Methodist Church.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I've been in ministry for a decade, and I already feel like, oh man, I've been through so much. I can't imagine 25 years.
Yeah.
Before we got into the issues that you and I both care about, that was a professional CV on you, and we're going to get into all of that. But I've wondered at you personally. We've talked about a lot of things outside of us, but I actually have no idea where you come from or what cultures you grew up around, what things inform you as a person. So, what's important to know about you on a personal level, and where your origin story?
Yeah, so I live in North Carolina, originally from here. I've been living in Charlotte now for, goodness, I think maybe 10 years or more, maybe a little longer, or in the area of Charlotte. But I was born in Greensboro. So my mom's family originally were from the Ohio area, moved to the Appalachians here in North Carolina, so she grew up there. Granddaddy was primitive Baptist, and they became missionary Baptist. Yeah, that is as Baptist as you get.
Wow.
Primitive.
Yeah.
And then became missionary Baptist, which there's a church, Mountain View Missionary Baptist Church in Rhonda, North Carolina, which is the foothills that my family founded. And my cousin is the pastor there to this day. We have our family reunions there every year.
Mm-hmm.
And I was actually baptized in a Baptist church and by one of my aunt's pastors. But yes, and then my dad's side of the family, originally from the Richmond, Virginia area, and there was a split in the family. A long story on that, but it was two brothers. Little kind of scuffle came about. One stayed in Richmond. The other moved here to the North Carolinas, added an S to the name. The other side of the family don't have an S. So brilliant. Yeah, it was that much of a divide between the two brothers. And so that's how my dad ended up here. And they were from a long line of Methodists. So, and then when my mom, yes.
And so it was a Baptist Methodist marriage from the beginning.
Exactly.
And that used to be a bigger deal than it is today.
It was a big deal because and with my parents' generation, the wife follows where the husband go. I mean, that was just a given for that generation of people. And so she became Methodist, but always had that Baptist bent. So it was interesting growing up in that kind of home because we could not have playing cards in the house. It was like that kind of upbringing.
Okay. Okay, so you were familiar with some of that real deal stuff from the early 20th century. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
You know a version of Methodism / Baptist American Christianity that actually required a good deal of self-denial and countercultural behavior.
Yes. Yes.
Cool.
Exactly.
So were your folks part of the predecessor denomination to the United Methodist Church?
Yes.
Okay.
That's where I learned a lot about the central jurisdiction through my parents and grandparents, because that's what they lived through. Through when in 1939, when the central jurisdiction was formed, to where the Blacks had to worship. And she would tell stories about how they would go up to Lenoir. Here in North Carolina, it was Lenoir, North Carolina, where they had their conference. But the one thing that I always heard when I was in seminary, I did a paper on that for one of my seminar classes because it was so fascinating. But the one thing that positives that came out of that was the development of leadership in the local churches, the leadership around the episcopacy, the leadership around pastors, and to be able to see that, because it's very important in most ethnic minority communities to be able to see people that look like us in that leadership capacity. I know it was a huge imprint on my life growing up, to see the older women in the church and their strong faith and my mom's faith. And that's what helped me to grow in my process.
Yeah, for people listening who might not know the history, and you briefly alluded to it, the United Methodist Church and its predecessor denomination as well had not just annual conferences, but jurisdictional conferences were the mid-level between the general conference and the annual conference. So there were 4, 5, 6 white jurisdictional conferences, but this was in the days of Jim Crow South and segregation, and so the central conference was made for Black Methodist churches to not. It was both white people wanting separation from Black people, but there's also this other part of segregation that people now are starting to talk about a little bit, But the notion is that there were actually some good things that came out of, and this is what I heard you saying as well. Whenever Black people, were not in the minority dominated by white folks in every setting, but they could
Yes.
actually be in the majority in some setting and
Mhm.
work on themselves, and leadership building is what you were talking about. But
Yes. Mhm.
I interviewed folks here locally who'd worked in what was called the Lincoln School, which was the segregated Black school here.
Mhm.
And one of the things that they remembered was how wonderful it was to learn from intelligent Black teachers, and
Mhm.
and whenever integration took place, a lot of those Black teachers had to get out of there because now the white teachers took over, and that kind of safe Black space was taken away. And that's one of
Yes.
the things that is recurring in society today, where a lot of Black voices are saying, we need to create Black-only spaces where we can once again focus on ourselves. So it's really interesting the kind of resegregation or self-segregation that we're seeing in America, in a civic
Mm.
sense as well,
Mhm.
but also, and we may circle back around to this later or not. The Global Methodist Church is wanting to
Mm.
be a global church for all people. But
Mhm.
then, does that mean that we all just have to meld together, or does that mean that we create separate spaces for different nationalities or ethnicities or cultures? So this is not a conversation that has gone away. In fact, we would probably be wise to look back to this era that your parents came out of for what
Mhm.
was good and what might be used again, and then what is just racist and cannot continue into the future.
Correct.
So
Yes.
yeah, I don't know what kind of conversations are even going to be had out in the open about that, but I'm personally interested in that because I grew up with the colorblind vision, where a lot of these ethnic and cultural distinctions really don't matter, and they separate us, and that's illegitimate in the household of God. So we just need to come together. But I found a lot of not just white people, but non-white people who were threatened by that vision and saying, we should be able to group like with like. Otherwise, some really bad things can happen. So I don't have any
Mhm.
wisdom there. I'm just kind of listening at this point. But I think I
Yeah.
understand what's at play. But I mean, as I understand it, there's been conversation around forming something similar in the GMC, where there can be different cultural or ethnic groups that are not necessarily thrown in with the rest of us, but have their own self-governance. I don't know if that's public or if I've even understood that correctly. We don't have to talk about that, but I don't think it's something that we can just say, oh, that's in the past. We don't have to worry about that anymore. But I've already talked over you long enough. You were giving us your history with your parents, where they come from, how you found yourself in the United Methodist Church growing up. So,
Mhm.
did you have siblings, or were you a princess growing up?
Well, maybe a little of both. I
Okay.
was the youngest.
Oh yeah, you're the baby. Okay.
I was and a daddy's girl, so I had him wrapped around my finger, and
Okay.
so because there was a big gap between my older sisters and myself. I sort of grew up like an only child. Once they were older and out of the home, it was just me there, and so it was probably a little combination of both there. But yeah, and even now as adults, I'm very close. My brother passed away 5 years
Mm.
ago, and so it's just me and my sisters now. I'm very close with them. We still do our vacations together and things like that. But when I was younger, they didn't want me around. I was like, oh, she's a baby.
Hmm.
Yeah, we're going to go do our own thing. You just go over there. I was one of those latchkey kids when I
Mm.
came home from school, and when my sisters were already out of the house, married and doing their thing. I would just come in, and also very much a nerd.
Oh yeah.
So I would come in, lock the door until my parents got home from work, and I would just read and do things to entertain myself. I'm a Gen X, and I think most of us grew up like that. And we're also what I call the forgotten generation.
Hmm.
People always forget to include Gen X and everything,
Hmm.
which was kind of like that growing up also. So we just learned how to be self-productive because we had to.
What year were
So
you born, Angela?
68.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I was
So I'm
born
the
'84. You were at the front end of Gen X. I was at the back end of Gen X.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
68. Okay. So you were born during the bad old days, and then you got to see that era of peace in the '70s and '80s. In
Exactly.
North
Yeah.
Carolina, I don't know as much about North Carolina. I've been reporting on North Carolina the last couple of weeks. I don't know if you've seen that, but I talked about Bishop Carter in the United Methodist Church. He issued an edict as to how it is that disaffiliated churches are and are not to act. And then they had their vote, their final disaffiliation vote, and I brought attention to that. Seemed like kind of a hostile context in the denomination, but it sounds to me like your upbringing in North Carolina was nice. You had a good family growing up.
It really was a great family. I mean, typical family where we have little things that pop up here and there, but overall, it was a very great family, good Christian family. As I said, I learned prayer and faith from my mom. My dad, I take after my dad on the introvert side. He was in the Army for many years, came out and then started his own business. Very quiet man, but full of a lot of wisdom. And so I would always enjoy, just during the summers, he would take me out and we would go blackberry picking. So that was always a highlight when I got to spend some time with him. And I was not as close to my mom as I was my dad. I did not become close to her until the later years. She passed away last year, but after my dad passed away, that's when I started to become closer to my mom. And so I can appreciate those years that I had with her before she passed away last year, because that gave me an opportunity to bond with her that I never did because I was always with my dad. So
it's a wonderful, we live in an age of great falling apart. A lot of families. I mean, I think it's really more normal nowadays to have families that have fallen apart rather than have stuck together. So it's always a pleasure to talk to somebody who, hey, I got along with both of my parents before they died, and I like all my siblings, and that's increasingly rare.
It is, and I think the funny part, looking back now, I never knew that my parents argue. I would always say, "Oh, they never argue." Well, they did. They just didn't do it in front of us.
So you grew up in the Methodist movement, in the Methodist Church. You were there. I'm assuming you were always close to the church. Am I right to think that?
I started teaching Sunday school at the age of 16.
Oh, wow. Okay.
To the adult class.
Did you really? Yeah. You taught adults as a 16-year-old, and they made room for you.
I think they just put up with me, but that experience was pretty tremendous. Yeah.
So is that where you started really feeling the interest in ordained pastoral ministry?
Funny you asked that question. So it was not until college when I call it my Isaiah moment, when Isaiah was in the temple on the Lord's day and saw him high and lifted up, and he came to himself in the midst of that holiness, and he said, "Whoa, I'm a man of unclean lips." Yeah. And it was my senior year in college. Well, I had just graduated from my senior year in college, undergrad, and that's when I had that moment where. And I gave my life to Christ, but I can appreciate being raised in the church because that helped me to get to that place, to realize it's not about just attending. It's not even about just because I teach Sunday school or I serve on committees as a young adult. There was this awakening that I had to have of the sinful state of who I am before Christ. And so with that said, the day that and it was October the 25th, 1990, the day that I gave my life to Christ, and that moment was also when I heard the call upon my life into ministry. God works with me through visions. And that evening, he showed me a vision that I was pastoring and leading a group of people that were various ethnicities. And I remember waking up out of that dream and I said, what in the world just happened to me? And the reason why it was a struggle, I did not respond right away because remember, even though we were Methodists, there was that Baptist influence in our life. And I was always told women cannot be, that you can't do this. So I stayed quiet. I didn't tell my family about that. I really struggled. I had just graduated from college. I was working at a university, Winston-Salem State University, and really just having a hard time going back. I became a certified lay speaker. I said, okay, I can do that. I'll be safe. But it just would not, that pressure kept coming against me. And the chief of security on the campus where I worked, he said, I need to introduce you to someone. He knew I was struggling in this call to ministry. And this person ended up being
the chief of security?
Yes, he would come by my office where I worked at Winston-Salem State, and we just struck up a friendship.
Okay.
And so, yeah.
How interesting. I don't know many people who have gotten spiritual advice and direction from security guards. That's what
I know. Isn't
that's
that something?
yeah. Okay, keep going.
So he introduced me to Arnetta Beverly. She was in law enforcement, left law enforcement, became a pastor here in Western North Carolina Conference. Eventually, she became a district superintendent, and one time was an Episcopal candidate. But he introduced me to her, and she took me under her wing and began to counsel with me and became my mentor. So 6 years down the road, I finally stopped running, and I said yes, but the hurdle was going to be telling my mom and dad. My dad would have been, he was okay. It was my mom. The fear and trepidation because of yeah. And she didn't accept it at first, but the first time she heard me preached, she said, "It's in you." And she came to accept it. So I entered seminary in 96.
Okay.
So yeah.
So you went to seminary at Duke before they were having worship to the queer God, I assume.
Woo!
And
Yes.
you graduated from there and went into ministry in Western North Carolina. Was there a point in Western North Carolina where radical left didn't have dominance, or was it always dominant and you learned how to operate under the radar?
One thing I can say about Western North Carolina, and I think this is what I'm seeing now, I think this is why it's so difficult. Western North Carolina has always had we have always been able to work together. Even our delegation, when I was a delegate to general conferences, our delegation was always very balanced. We had centrists, we had traditionalists, we had progressives, and it was always that way. Which, by the way, I want to go back to something real quick before I finish.
Yeah.
The vision that I had in 90, didn't understand it then, saw it in fruition throughout my 24 years of ministry. Every appointment I had was a cross-racial, cross-cultural appointment. And there was also several years where I did teachings on these type of ministries to various ethnicities. And so that's one of my heartbeat passions also. You mentioned something earlier, and I would love for GMC to have conversations about this because I think it's great. But back to the, so I've always saw that balance.
Well, wait, let me make sure I heard you right, because what I hear you saying is you received this vision of yourself serving in cross-cultural appointments, that your passion, your call is not necessarily, hey, I'm here to build up the Black church. It's more, I'm here to build up the church in a post-racial future. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct. Yes.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to make sure. I feel like you and I are part of the same project there, but I come from a different social location. So, and then also before you go forward, Western North Carolina Conference, what percentage of it was Black churches?
I don't know the accurate percentage. We had,
like, were there a lot or just a few?
We had a lot. Okay. And they were very healthy. When I was growing up, and even in my earlier years of ministry, they started to take a turn, most of them, I would say probably about 10 years ago or so, 10 to 12 years ago, where there's a decline that began to take place. Some had to go from full-time to part-time. And even in the district that I was in, we had many Black clergy, full-time elders that were needing full-time appointments, but we didn't have Black churches that were full-time. So what I did in the Catawba Valley District was I supplemented salaries, and then we had what was called Vitality Associates. So I got with our Vitality Associate and the leadership of the church to help them to build up to a place where they can eventually be able to take a full-time pastor with the full pay. So each year we would decrease the salary and they would pick it up. So we helped to revitalize a lot of those churches that were slowly declining.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And
so the conference was not hostile. There were left, right, center, but the battle lines hadn't been drawn. There was happy collaboration until the temperature got turned up enough, and now things are what they are. You did write on your Facebook, and I got your permission to bring this up beforehand.
Yes.
But part of what you and many are healing from in the GMC is when things got overtly dysfunctional and nasty in the UMC. So I'm going to read this post because I think you did a really good job summing it up. My story began in June 2019. At our annual conference, the traditionalists in Western North Carolina was lifting my name as a possible Episcopal candidate. There was a group of colleagues I'd known throughout my entire ministry. I've always been a traditionalist in my theology. They have always been more progressive, but for me, friendship is not based on how one thinks, but on trust and respect. But these individuals falsely accused me of informing my district how to vote in the election of delegates to the General Conference. I was serving as a district superintendent. At first, I could not believe that they did not come directly to me, but went behind my back to falsely accuse me. Several days later, I received an email from one of the clergy with an accusation. That accusation, my response was, hey, Matthew 18 says come one-on-one. Why didn't you come directly to me? I could have told you that this is a false accusation. And even when it was proven false, and ask any clergy in my district at the time, they would have told you they received nothing from me. I never received an apology. After that event, it continued to escalate. I received harassing emails and phone calls. I met with an attorney who said, Angela, this is a clear case of harassment and discrimination. Words cannot capture the damage this did to my soul. I, too, felt the depression, anger, and bitterness. And friends, my depression was deep and real. So I took time away on spiritual renewal leave for healing. God had to work with me through bitterness and anger that was harming my soul. I'm now in a better place. My trust is not fully there, but I do have forgiveness in my heart. I think I'll publish just a scan of this post. It goes on a little bit longer about healing, and we'll talk about healing in this conversation. But for viewers or listeners who are spending their time with us, you're a person who knows about the deep, it's not just a systemic dysfunction in the United Methodist Church, but it resulted in great interpersonal harm and nastiness. And it took people that had been colleagues and had mutual respect and obliterated all of that whenever the time came to figure out in 2019 which way we're going to go. And the people on the left did not get their way. All of the previous rules were thrown out the window, and friends became enemies. And that really came as a shock to a lot of people on the right who had participated in this notion for decades that, hey, we can disagree and have mutual respect. One of the lessons that I've wanted to make sure that people coming into the GMC have learned is that far left liberalism, leftism, does not honor friendship, not like this. They honor being on the right side of history. They've determined what that looks like, and people are a means to an end to making that happen. And that's something that I think everybody saw in the United Methodist Church, but it's so ugly that we just go, no, we can't talk about that. We can't acknowledge that. But and we'll come back around to what lessons need to be learned. To my understanding is if we don't learn the lessons rightly and say out loud what we've learned, then we are much more likely to replicate those mistakes that got made. That mistake being trusting that friendship was more important than ideological loyalty. So one more piece of your puzzle coming into this that I've been curious about is, I know how Keith Boyette got in his position. I know how Walter Fenton got in his position. I know how most of the people at the top leading this thing got to where they are. I don't know how you got from where you were to get in the position you're at right now. What's the connecting tissue?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. And I do want to say one thing with Bishop Carter before I answer that question. When I was on the Board of Ordained Ministry, and I chaired the Call and Discipline Committee on the Board of Ordained Ministry, Bishop Carter was on the Board of Ordained Ministry as well. We used to carpool together back and forth to the meetings.
Oh, wow.
And yes, and he was always a supporter. And there were times I preached at his church, Providence Methodist. When my mom died last year, he sent a sympathy card, and he handwrote. It was a very nice message in there. I know a lot of things that he has done, but I can say that that respect he has still demonstrated that towards me. Bishop Leland was the bishop I was under when I was on the cabinet, when a lot of the things that happened. Once I left, Bishop Carter came, I think it was the year after I left the UMC. Mm-hmm. I did want to say that, and so speaking of that, when I did leave, it's when everything had escalated to a point to fill in that gap from the letter that you read at the 2019 annual conference, and then going forward, leading into 2020. I mentioned to you earlier, God works with one of the ways that He worked with me is through visions. After that annual conference, and even the progressive pastors in my district said, we didn't receive anything from her. Mm-hmm. But it was a way to shut down what the traditionalists were trying to do, which was to lift my name as an Episcopal candidate, because the progressives had a name they wanted to lift. So they were doing everything they can, because it would have been a chargeable offense if on the cabinet if someone's told their district how to vote. Yeah. So they were doing everything they can to shut that down. But going into the fall of that year, when I left that annual conference, I knew in my spirit that was my last annual conference. I would not be back.
Sure.
I didn't know what was going to unfold, but I knew in my spirit that was the last. Mm-hmm. Going into the fall of that year, God showed me 2 visions in a dream, and then in January, a third. And each one came to fruition. That's when you know it's of God. Mm-hmm. The first one was of the bishop. And when the traditionalists wanted to lift my name as an Episcopal candidate, since I was on their cabinet, I said, I cannot answer you until I first speak to. So I tried to follow every proper protocol. I said, I first need to speak to Bishop Leland to make sure that this is okay if a caucus group is going to lift my name up. Mm-hmm. So he and I met over breakfast one morning. He said, absolutely. I was wondering when somebody was going to pick you up and as an Episcopal candidate. So he gave the stamp of approval. But deep in my spirit, I was very uncomfortable going into the annual conference with this. I ended up saying yes to the Evangelical Association here in Western North Carolina Conference, but I was still disturbed. And that's when everything unfolded at the 2019. I even had one person, one of the ones who was fighting against me, say, well, you were on the cabinet. You should have not had your name on that list to be lifted up. And I reminded that person, I said, our assistant to the bishop was on the progressive list. Her name was lifted by the progressives. Our conference secretary was on the progressive list. Another district superintendent, 2 district superintendents on the cabinet name was on the progressive list.
That's so silly.
Exactly. So I said, why was it a problem with my name?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So that was the first thing.
The answer is, and you already know this, you remember Larry Elder ran for governor of California, but because he's conservative, they called him the blackface of white supremacy. Similarly, you're a black lady, and oh man, would they love to have a black lady, but you didn't have the right beliefs, so you might as well have been a white supremacist, so... They say they want diversity, but they don't want diversity of opinion or theology. They just want the same opinion with a different face and body. Yes. So they summon special hatred for people like you who don't toe that line and who say, no, I don't care about that stuff the way that you do. So it's really weird. You would think that they would feel more guilt for behaving in the ways that they did to derail someone like you. But I think they actually take more joy in shutting down someone like you than someone who perhaps looks like me and has my history in theology. Because you should know better, Angela, than to have those views. So yeah, that's the times we're living in.
I've been told that.
I bet you have. Yeah, I interviewed Mal Herr, who's a Hmong clergy in Wisconsin, who was told that she had been, what was the phrase? Pretty much brainwashed by white colonialism. That her mind had been colonized. I think that's what they said.
Wow.
I just think it takes real idiocy to say that to the fact that white people will say that to people who are not white is just so crazy to me. So anyway,
and I was thinking that.
Yeah,
you're exactly right.
Man, that's bananas. But yeah, I'm 100% certain that's what was behind justifying the action that took place against you in Western North Carolina. It's not on the same level, but what I reported on last week was they had a couple legacy churches they really wanted to hold on to. And so they
Mm,
started a
mm.
campaign of creating a stink around one of them in particular, focused on lies and misrepresentations, but
Yes,
that doesn't matter to them. What matters is, the ends justify the means for them.
exactly.
But they still, as you acknowledge that Carter is a really decent guy and did show kindness that is above and beyond what is expected or required. We should also acknowledge Western North Carolina did make the right decision, even if 300 some voted ungraciously. The right side prevailed, and so it would be wrong to act as though this is, well, yeah. In your case, all it took was a vocal minority to throw the whole things off. But whenever it comes down to just the vote, did they end up voting on you?
No, that it
Okay.
was and this is the first time ever in history of Western North Carolina that it was not only a clean slate of progressives that were voted on in the
Mhm.
delegation. There was not one traditionalist that ended up on the delegation, but also with clergy, laity always had a good way of getting their votes done. And within the first or second day, laity, we were always at the ninth hour, just trying to get everything in on that Saturday night. This was the first time by the second day they had every slate filled.
Mm.
And it was just, I did find out later that there were some other people on the cabinet that were putting delegates on the, because you have to have the at-large delegates. So they were very intentional to make sure that the at-large delegates were progressive. So I thought that was interesting too. The things that I was accused of that I didn't do was actually what some of the others were actually doing. So that was also interesting. Yeah.
I run into that
Yeah.
all the time on this. James Lindsay has termed that the iron law of woke projection. They accuse you of doing what they
Mm,
themselves are doing. So, yeah,
yes.
we could go on this train for much longer, I'm sure. But okay,
Yeah.
so how did
Yeah.
that connect you to the GMC
So
leadership?
yeah, so going into the end of 2019 into 2020, with those three visions that I had, in each one of those visions, what God showed me was the attacks are going to increase. That was not the end of it. It is going to increase.
Mhm.
The first vision, it was revealed that this is exactly what is going to be said. Bishop Leland is going to come to you. This is what he's going to say. And that actually happened. In the second vision, it was revealed who was operating behind it. And that came to fruition. To the person that was actually behind this in Bishop Leland's ear, kind of navigating everything,
Mm.
that came to fruition. That was revealed. And then in January of 2020, it was shown that this is going to be the climax of what's going to happen.
Mm.
And of course, that came to
Mm.
fruition at what happened. So I got to the place that I said, we were in cabinet meeting. This was before the shutdown. We were out of town meeting, working on appointments right before COVID and the lockdown and everything. We actually had to stop that meeting early because they were telling everybody you need to, get back in and so forth. But I went to Bishop Leland and said, I'm coming off the cabinet.
Mm.
I thought if I go back into a local church, I will be forgotten. Everything will be okay. Well, it wasn't.
Yeah, you
I went
thought
back
wrong.
into
That's not how it works. Sorry. Go on. Tell us more.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
It got worse actually,
Ugh.
and finally, I just took. That's when I applied for a sabbatical, and I was granted that. And so, while I was on that sabbatical, I knew I could not continue in the UMC, and I got away, spent time in prayer. And when I read that scripture, if you are teaching any other gospel, you stand accursed.
Mm.
I knew I have to leave the UMC. I did not know what that next step was going to look like. I had
Mhm.
nothing lined up. This position did. There was. It was announced that they were going to be hiring somebody for this position.
Mhm.
And I had met the national WCA leadership because at the time it was under WCA, the denomination wasn't launched yet. I chaired a task team on race and equality to work on a policy for what will be the new denomination.
Mhm.
So I was in Alabama when I presented our task team work to them. So I had an opportunity to sit and meet a lot of the people on the
Okay.
National WCA
Yeah.
Council.
And you made an
Um,
impression for obvious reasons. Yeah. Okay.
I hope so. I don't know, but and so people who they here in Western North Carolina, they said, well, just put your name in and see what happens. I sent my resume off, and they narrowed it down to 4 people. I was one of the ones they interviewed, and then Keith called me up and said, "Are you ready to go to work?" And so that's how I ended up in this position, and then transferred over when the GMC launched.
And so you rightly sit in a position where you're highly visible and highly influential. You have I was scrolling down your Facebook timeline this morning, and it's just booking after booking of going and encouraging people here, and then going and encouraging, and that's all for good reason. It doesn't. A lot of what you're doing doesn't directly overlap with your job description necessarily, because really your job description is sit in front of a computer and scrutinize all of the people that are applying to become GMC clergy, which we need someone solid in that position. Gatekeepers are absolutely essential. If we don't have quality clergy coming in, you might as well just kiss the dream of the GMC goodbye. So on behalf of everybody, thank you for filling that role. And I know it's not always filling to spend hours and hours over this minutia of what additional educational requirements need to be met for this candidate. And, everybody is different and everybody has their own desires that you operate around them. And I personally know of different times where you have taken time personally to talk to people on the phone to help them. It's just, you have to have people do this. It is not a fun job. It is not even a spiritually fulfilling job a lot of the time until you get to see the fruit of your labors. So a lot of people have already talked to you about that and interviewed you about that and what that's about. And so there's a where did I hear you talk about it on a podcast? There is a podcast associated with the WCA. I was listening to it while doing yard work about 6
Maybe
months
Sterling
ago.
Allen.
Say that again?
Was it Sterling Allen?
I don't think so, but I did see that Sterling also interviewed you. I never watched that one. So anyway, a lot of people have covered those bases with you. I just looked at the time. I can't believe we've already been talking as long as we have. So
Oh, wow.
I know what I want to do. I know how I want to weave this together. As should be obvious to anyone who's already listened to you, you are very strong in the signs and wonders, spiritual worldview of the Bible, of the Christian faith. This is a particular gifting of yours, which you are wanting to offer to the church broadly, and which it seems to me that you're gifted to do. But secondly, you work with LEOs in your capacity, primarily law enforcement, Back the Blue. You're a chaplain. You've counseled a lot of guys through trauma. I was a first responder for 2 years, 1 or 2 years here as a volunteer firefighter. And in that time, there were traumatic things that happened. You see things on the front line of emergencies. And, faith deals with not just the real stuff, the realest stuff, life and death, salvation, damnation. We often try and domesticate and clean up things in life, but the faith of Jesus Christ isn't one of those things that you can domesticate. And it has everything to do with trauma and healing. I wanted to just tell you about this book that I read, The End of Trauma, by a guy who studies trauma, George A. Bonanno. And he stops just short of saying what I've suspected, but he talks about longitudinal studies that look at how people process trauma around 9/11 or the Boston Marathon bombing. And one of the things that we notice is that people generally, not without exception, but generally are quite resilient and can heal whenever they are not interfered with by a society that is obsessed with safetyism. One of the things we know is that people are real traumatized when they watch TV about it, media. People that were at the bombing in Boston were not as traumatized as people who just watched the news about it. So trauma is a weird, interesting thing. Trauma also is something that if you don't deal with it, it can really come back in a nasty way. And so I wanted to just let you speak for at least 10 minutes and just share what you think about how it is that, the Global Methodist Church is made up almost entirely of people who got chewed up and spat out by, well, they didn't get spat out. They just got chewed up and then had to fight their way out of the United Methodist Church. And then we have a spiritual reality that very much has to do with healing, very much has to do with visions and dreams and the Spirit pouring into us. How, you're not queen of the GMC. I'm not king. We're just two people in the GMC talking about what we hope it can be. We both hope that the GMC is not acting out of trauma from the UMC. We want it to be healed. What does that look like practically as we process what we've been through? What does that look like spiritually as we are led by people like you who can teach us to walk in the Spirit and be healed? So go whatever direction you want to go with that, and I'm very excited to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're bringing this up. And usually when I go around and preach at different places, I always try to touch on this because I think it's one of the, maybe one of the forgotten avenues that we need to be looking at, or neglected for not forgotten, but neglected for right now.
Right.
Is I have this thing that I do with my officers, and I call it the soda pop, the soda can type ministry. And so whenever they come in my office, I have an office at the police department. So whenever they come in, they call me Chap. They said, "Okay, Chap, soda can time." And what I do when I did this with them many years ago, but I had a soda bottle. And when I went in to talk and roll call, I was shaking it up as I was talking. And so in the middle of my talking, I stopped, and one of the officers, I said, "Officer so-and-so, open that, I'm thirsty." And immediately he pushed back and said, "No." And I said, "You gonna let me die of thirst up here? Open it for me." And he said, "No." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because it's gonna go everywhere." I said, "Stop. Say that again." He said, "You just shook it up and all that on the inside, and once I open, it's gonna go." I said, "Exactly." And then I began to talk about when trauma gets trapped in our body. That's what happens for law enforcement. And they live in this hypervigilance because they go from scene to scene. And even when they're not going from scene to scene, but they're in their cruiser, they're still on this heightened awareness, just scanning and watching, waiting for that next call to come in, not knowing what that call is going to be. Even a simple traffic stop is not simple because you never know what's going to happen.
Right. Yeah.
So and when you're looking at 12-hour shifts, they are on more than they're off with the shifts because they're doing 12 hours back to back to back, constantly living in that state. And all of that is building up in their bodies. So even when they're off, they're not off. When they go home, it's not easy to turn that off because you need so many hours for your body to come for that, what I call that parasympathetic nervous system to start taking over that can help calm you down.
Yeah, the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight, hypervigilant, ready to go into action at any time. You're on, and then you can't just instantly switch off. It takes,
exactly.
Okay, I hear you.
Exactly. And so what it did end up doing with that soda bottle, and I used a bottle instead of a can because it's easier to demonstrate, is if you unscrew the cap just a little bit at a time, you can actually begin to take it all off without it fizzling everywhere. And then that led me into talking about healthy ways that we can help to deal with that trauma that we've been holding on the inside. Now, why did I bring all that up? Yeah. Because as we saw people transferring over, and you stated it, many of us, if not all of us, were just chewed up. And as we started to see people transferring over, I want to go back even before that. Not only what we went through trying to get out of a denomination, but what happened right before that, COVID. So you're looking at one crisis after another, and probably some was going through their own individual crisis even before COVID. There was a lot of things that people were walking through, whether it was in their personal life, the life of the church.
Yes.
So, yeah. And where I saw it with the work that I'm doing, this is how I saw the symptoms coming out, was you could tell that there was a lot of stuff built up. And at the time it was difficult to go through, but looking back now that I'm still walking through my own healing and knowing being able to spot what other people were coming through, but there were many that were not polite. I would just say it that way. It was difficult because I'm so grateful for provisional conferences and districts now And I had one person in one provisional district call yesterday, and I was helping her through an application, and she said, as hard as it is for me here in this provisional area and the work that I'm doing, I have help. I don't know how you as one person did this for so many months when we first launched. All of that was just me sitting behind a laptop trying to respond by hand. We didn't have an online system yet. So by hand, every single application, reading through every transcript, reading every background check. Something was always left off the application. I had to reach back out to but yet it was, and I kept trying to tell people, please be patient. I'm trying to work as best, and it was brutal. Some of the emails were just, nope. It was like, I'm like, why can't these people understand? So looking back now, I know what it was. And every time I tried to, lift it up, and I would hear people say, oh, it's just anxiety.
Hey, wait, I think what I just heard you say is that a lot of people in your correspondence with them were less than polite, were not appreciative. And these were GMC people. And one could easily go, I don't know if I want to join this group if it's full of a bunch of rude people. But the connection you're drawing, I think, is these are people who got chewed up just like I did, and they haven't worked through it. And so, it's going to be exploding on people and getting on other people around them until it's dealt with.
Yeah, that was the soda. I mean, it was fizzling out everywhere.
Okay.
And we can't brush that away just by saying, well, they're just filled with anxiety. We can't brush that away like that. We have to get to that deep place, because what's going to happen if we don't, we're going to have triggers.
Okay.
When people have gone through a traumatic situation, let me give you an example of what I mean by, for those who may not know what I'm talking about when I say trigger. Back in the end of September, I was in a wreck. I was at a red light. Someone crashed into the back of me. That was the first time ever I was in a wreck. It totaled my car. And now I'm noticing when I drive, when I was coming back from Georgia in October, when we had our meeting there, and I was stopped on the highway on the exit because there was a lot of traffic. And I looked in my rearview mirror, and there was a car barreling. He didn't look like he was going to stop. Trigger. My mind immediately went back to September when that car hit me and I froze. Fight or flight or freeze. I'm one that I freeze, and I froze. I tensed up. That's a trigger. So if we don't help to get to that place of where the wounds are and that deep hurt, we're going to have a lot of triggers that come forth. And so my prayer and goal is, what can we do to help people get to that place of healing so our denomination can be healthy and whole, so we in turn can go out and help others, not just in our churches, but in the world. To get to that place of healing.
If we can't be healed of our hurt, what exactly do we imagine we're offering people? We can say we're offering Jesus, but Jesus is the master physician. He's the healer. So if we're not healed, what exactly are we offering, And granted, we have to be gracious. Some healing takes a long period of time. Some of it isn't experienced till the coming kingdom. But if we don't even give healing a chance, like if we don't even try and process it, if we just try and get past it and just move on, and then, one of the things I've been so discouraged by seeing in the United Methodist Church, you'd see so much bad behavior, and then people say, well, they're very emotional. It's like, well, no crap. But I mean, we're supposed to be not just adults, we're supposed to be Christians. We're supposed to be peacemakers. Why all of a sudden are we making room for misbehavior just because we have strong feelings, just because we're upset and emotional? That is not a license to mistreat other people. But that's what we're making room for in the GMC if we don't expect people to name what they've been through, to give that to Christ Jesus and let him take away that trauma, to restore us to who we were before we experienced such a thing. It's like this, when I talk about this with people, it's like I'm speaking Martian sometimes. Like,
me too.
the only frame of reference so many people have is, if I speak about negative things, then I'm failing. And not only that, it's almost like I'm acknowledging that God failed or something. And it's not a failure on God's part for us to go through bad things. I think it betrays some kind of spiritual prosperity gospel. Like, if God's with us, we're not going to go through hard stuff. We went through hard stuff, so God wasn't with us. And then I also think that's kind of what's behind, and maybe we can steer it towards the spiritual stuff, but I see almost this like, emphatic, like the Spirit's with us now. Oh, he wasn't with us before, but oh, he's with us now, and we're going to see all kinds of growth and success now. And I think
Yes.
what's undergirding that is not entirely rational. I think it is this kind of like, well, he must not have been with us before because he really let us down. We went through a hard time. So now let's be happy. Let's not
Yeah.
talk about that. Let's talk about the new stuff, the new hope. And for people
Yeah.
like me, I'm going, I don't know if the Holy Spirit is going to operate with people that aren't even going to acknowledge the
Yeah.
darkness. What exactly?
Exactly.
Anyway, I feel like I talked long enough on that. But how important
No.
do you think it is for us to name individually and collectively what we went through, and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
expect now Global Methodist leadership to be mature and sober and forthright about naming the failures of the
Yeah.
past? Yeah, go ahead and do whatever you want with
Yeah.
that.
No, you're spot on with everything you just said, because one of the things that I keep hearing is when provisional areas have their worship services and ordination service, what I'm hearing from that is, oh, yay, everything's great now.
Mhm.
People are, the worship services are wonderful and uplifting. And they are. I've been to
Yeah.
some of them,
Yes.
and they are.
Mhm.
But guess what? What about the next day?
Mhm.
When we go and when we haven't processed what has happened and what is continued to happen,
Mhm.
what about the next day, and then the next day, and the next
Exactly.
day?
Yeah.
So again, we can't just bury it, because we've seen what happened, what if we do that.
Mhm.
In an ideal world, if I can share
Yeah.
what I think would have been great, and it's not too late, what would it have looked like if we, and I know there's several things out there. Some people are doing the bands.
Mhm.
In seminary at Wesley Biblical, one of my professors, he wrote a book on this called Dr. Friedman, the 5Q method, which is similar to the band. One of the things I like about the 5Q method, it gives you practical application to live into for that week. But things like that, what would it have looked like if we started with the TLC and the general church staff mandatory to go through this, to be able to
Mm.
name all of our stuff? Because that's important. The naming is so
Yeah.
important. When we want to avoid something, we don't name it, and we try to gloss it over, pretend everything's okay, while it's continuing to fester. But when we can actually name what's happening inside of us. So what would that have looked like? And then as we began to raise up the president pro tems and the district leaders, then we help them to set up these groups, whatever you want to call it, bands or small places of healing.
I'm gonna
And
say
then
something real weird, real quick. I'm
yeah.
sorry, but it just now occurred to me, and I love this thought. Exorcism, of course, is something Jesus and the disciples and Christians of all ages have done. One of the a protocol for exorcism, right at the very beginning, is getting the demon's name. Because when you have the
Yes.
name over something, that's what allows you control over it and
Yeah.
power over it. And so as we're talking about naming the things done wrong in the past, if we want to make this a sort of exorcism, and I think that's entirely appropriate to talk about, then getting the name of
Yeah.
that demon is really essential for eventually casting it out. So if we're not intentionally getting that name, how are we going to cast it out? So, okay, so you were talking about, hypothetically, if we could go back in time, it sure would have been good to make it mandatory for all people in leadership in the GMC to go through this group healing and accountability process, so as to cast out those, I'm using my metaphor
Yes.
now, cast out these demons that would otherwise plague this new organization.
Yeah, yeah, and to continue that process,
Mhm.
as once the provisional areas were made, then the president pro tems together as a group, and they
Sure.
in turn could lead their presiding elders, who
Mhm.
lead the clergy, who leads the leadership within there, and so on and so on.
Mhm.
And I mean, like I said, just hypothetical.
Yeah. No, that's a
What
worthy
could it
thought.
have looked like? Yeah,
Well, and it's
yeah.
not, I guess it might be too late for a top down approach, but
Mhm.
I do think it's worth a prolonged attempt to compel people, especially people in positions of leadership,
Yes.
into some form of accountability discipleship groups where the expectation is, well, so the larger thing I think, though, is, Angela, it's a cultural thing that it doesn't have racial norms around it, but it does have, oh heck, spiritual prosperity gospel overtones,
Mm.
or
Mm.
Are we going to be a movement that's all positive, or are we going to be a movement that is more sober? That's how I would. Are we going to be a people that are known for being able to acknowledge the darkness
Yeah.
while also not succumbing to the darkness?
Mhm.
That's what I think
Mhm.
is the real undergirding fear for so many people is if we acknowledge it, then we've lost. If we acknowledge it,
Yeah.
then we let the devil in. And there's not a reality of the devil's already in. He was here before
Yeah,
you even got here. And
that's
you need to
right.
know how to spiritually arm yourself. And so many people don't want to identify as a combatant. They want to
Yeah.
identify as a civilian. And there is no civilian in God's army.
Here's and you just made me think about this. Here's where I know that if we do not do this, because
Mhm,
so many clergy right now do not know how to reach out and walk alongside people who are in that dark place.
mhm,
Last year, when I went through that, I call it my dark night of the soul.
mhm,
You can call it depression, you can call it whatever. I had lost my mom a couple of weeks after my mom's funeral. My close friend was killed in a tragic accident. I had to preach his funeral. Then I got COVID, and then trying to deal with the applications and the
mm,
crazy emails. So I went into a dark night of the soul,
mhm.
and there were some people just that walked away from me. They didn't know, they reached out, and I was just in a really dark place,
Mm.
and eventually they just stopped talking to me. And when I was able, except for a few, and I tell you, my law enforcement officers were right there.
I bet they
That
were.
became my
Yeah.
church.
Uh-huh.
That became my church. And they began to speak into me
Yeah.
and help me through that time. And looking back now, I'm thinking that's because we don't know how to walk alongside people like that.
Right.
And we don't want to know how to deal with our own, let alone trying to walk alongside others. So we can't just walk away from people when
Mhm.
they're in that dark
That's
place.
right.
So
Yeah,
it's
what you're
so
talking about is something that I heard Francis Chan talk about with, he baptized a
important.
gang member into his church, ran into a couple weeks later, and the gang
Mhm.
member said, "The church has not given me the intimacy that my gang gave me."
Yeah.
And what's
Yeah.
often exposed is that our local churches have been playing church rather than being church, and they don't
Yes.
really know how to do life together. And that's what the class and band meetings are really about, is doing life together. But so much, it's not just our laity, our clergy don't even know how to be intimately in
Exactly.
relationship and walk with people. And if we cannot take care of each other like that, if we don't even, the question is not can we learn to, the question is do we even want to learn to, or do we
Yes,
just
that's
want
good.
a nice big organization with a lot of energy? Because that's not the same
Mm.
thing. So
Yeah.
you and me are of the mind, let's stop playing church, let's be the church.
Mhm.
Let's make it so that anybody in a Global Methodist church, when they're going through a dark period, they're already in a group of people that are
Yes.
walking with them, that are not going to let them go, that are not going to. And if we're not interested in creating that, I'm of the mind that that's core and key to being a Methodist. I would actually say if we're not building that, then we are not authentic Methodists.
Yeah,
But that's the
absolutely.
conversation that's happening right now. I feel
Mhm.
like you and I have just made a pretty good case for it. So I want to give you the
Yeah.
last word for anyone who's been spending time with us on this and
Mhm.
might not be familiar with all of these concepts and pieces of the biblical worldview that we've introduced. How would you urge them to meditate and reflect on this conversation? What do you think are the final closing things that are important to say here?
Yeah, I think to if we can help people, whoever's watching this, and they're looking at this thing and seeing themselves in this,
Hmm.
um, to find you can call me or whomever, but to find someone to say, what can I do to begin those next steps? I think it's so important. And don't be afraid if you say, I've been working on this for some time and I feel like I keep falling back. Just this week,
Hmm.
and I've been doing this a long time with law enforcement, just this week on Monday, there's somebody who I've been working with the database, and a flurry came up in me, and I didn't lash out at the person, but I said, call me right now, da 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 da. And after I left that message, I stepped back and said, why did I just leave that? I had to do a self-assessment.
Hmm.
And why? Because I had a trigger. It
Mm.
was an email that I got from this person, and it sent a trigger in me from something from my past with all that I went through, leaving the UMC, coming into the GMC. And when the person called me, the first thing I did was apologize. I said, this just sent me back to a place. I took it out on you, but it's not about you. It's really about me. And we had a
Good.
great conversation.
Good.
So don't be afraid when you're thinking, oh, I thought I was making progress. And it happens. It happens because we're going to have those triggers. But let's not continue to keep our head in the sand as if everything is going to be okay. But let us take those steps to learn what can we do about this and how can we help each other and ourselves.
Is there a single resource, a book, or a website that you think it would be just really good for people to dip into if they're interested in learning about spiritual healing?
Wow, I have so many books on that. I can't think of one right off the
How
top of my
about
head.
how about we'll have a day or so between when we
Yeah.
close off and when I publish. How about folks, if you're interested in learning more about this, reading more, and reflecting on this, check the show notes, whether you're listening to the
Yeah.
podcast or watching somewhere else. And I will put links to whatever resources that Reverend Pleasance recommends, because I do think that this is something, if I hadn't encountered this before, I would want to know more. And neither
Mm.
you nor I have
Mhm.
published much on this, so we've got to be able to connect people. So we'll connect you in the show notes. Angela, thank you so much for taking the time with me today. I doubt this is going to be the only time we publicly talk. You clearly have many giftings to offer, and thank you for offering what you have to the GMC. And may the Global Methodist Church continue to be a place where we can have these conversations in the open about what we need to be, and let's be optimistic about the GMC being and doing so much more than what we were able to do before. So, friends, thank you so much for joining me and Angela. Pray for her. She's going to continue to be in an influential place in the Global Methodist Church for some time. I just saw that there's going to be a group convened where you and Reverend Henners and Bishop Jones and like 8 other people are going to be talking
Yes.
about the future of Methodism, the nature of Methodism. So
Yeah.
we need to pray for your wisdom and forbearance with the rest of us who sometimes don't get it. We need your patient leadership. So God bless you, and thank you for spending time with me. Friends, if you want to follow up with Angela, don't do it. She's really busy. She she doesn't have time. But have these conversations with the people in your church and figure out how you want to be. And if this has been a blessing to you, just want to thank you for spending time with us. Feel free to sign up for PlainSpoken at Locals, plainspoken.locals.com. If you want to become a supporter, that really helps me out to build this thing out more. I can talk to even more interesting people. But if you're not in a position to do that, just go over to YouTube or Facebook, wherever you are, like and subscribe to that, because I'm going to continue to have a lot more conversations like this. And I think this is a worthy conversation. So, Angela, one more time, thank you so much.
Thank you.